Hello, everyone. This is Peter from The Burning Question. I have the pleasure of having with me today Michael Rodriguez, who's a PhD student at the University of California, Riverside. Michael, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. So Michael and I caught up probably, I think, via Twitter because of some really interesting work he'd been doing. He presented, beginning of last week at the American Chemical Society? Yes. Yeah. I got to look through some of his presentation. It was super interesting work on the relationship of basically digestate, so the material that comes out of anaerobic digesters, and biochar. So, Michael, why don't you first tell us a little bit about who you are and how you've gotten into biochar, and then we'd love to hear a little bit more about your study.
Yeah. So again, hi everyone, my name is Michael. I am a PhD student at UC-Riverside. And so I've been working with biochar and other organic amendments ever really since I started my research career as an undergrad at UC Davis. I was very fortunate and lucky enough that I was able to work with Dr. Sanjay Parikh at UC Davis, doing a lot of stuff with biochar. At the time, it was doing stuff with biochar regarding nitrogen, bleaching, and then I moved into stuff with oil remediation in oil contaminated soils using biochar. And then now I'm at UC Riverside, and my project is on measuring greenhouse gas emissions from the land application of these organic amendments and the context of dairies. So my group with Dr. Francesca Hopkins at UC Riverside, a lot of our work revolves around greenhouse gas emissions regarding California dairies, because California dairies are a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions and are a pretty large piece of California's greenhouse gas emissions budget. Mm-hmm. And so my role in the project is to measure potential greenhouse gas emissions reductions regarding different handling of manure management, essentially. Mm-hmm. Because the conventional management strategy at these dairy farms is to land apply the manure as an organic fertilizer to grow feed. But associated with that is a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. But because of certain legislation that's happening in California revolving around manure management and methane reduction strategies, there is growing need and then also opportunity for manure management into biochar or anaerobic digestion or composting and all that good stuff. And then I measured the associated carbon dioxide and N2O dynamics that go on with that.
Super awesome. For those of us who don't know the California dairy scene very well, can you describe, how many cows is it, or how big is the dairy in California relative to, say, other places in the country or relative to the national size?
That's a great question. I don't know the exact numbers of the number of cows, but it's very large.
Oh, sorry.
And yeah, it's very large. Especially, obviously in California, we're home to like the large Central Valley, which is like the huge agricultural region of California. But also there's a good number of dairies in the North Coast area of California, and then also a few in Southern California, where I've been lucky to visit a couple of those. I can tell you that right now, because of the push for anaerobic digestion and these like alternative manure management strategies in California, there's a little bit over 100 dairies that are now either being planned or currently have an anaerobic digester.
Wow.
That are in the works.
Wow. Okay, so pretty big scale, right? So when you talk about reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, it's not, even small percentages would imply a large reduction because of the scale of the problem, so to speak.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And then because we have a lot of people here that are very curious and probably involved in local policy, what is the policy that California has put in place to encourage people to use either anaerobic digesters or other ways of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions relative to dairies?
Yeah, so in California, the big kind of policy change that's like motivating a lot of this research is SB 1383, which is a policy implemented in order to reduce methane emissions from organic waste, essentially. And it's and it's affected all sectors. So, municipal solid waste, reduction of food waste, but also on the dairy side, really affecting how dairies are going to be managing their manure methane emissions. And so that's kind of like the policy motivation behind this. But so dairies are saying, okay, we need to reduce our methane by a certain percentage by state regulation. That's what's kind of driving, okay, let's implement some of this technology.
So you have kind of policy stick saying you must do this thing, and then policy carrot, like we talked, and I think you just referenced some statewide support for encouraging farmers and helping them pay or finance or anaerobic digesters, right?
Yes. So in the state of California, there's a couple of really like great programs that the state is pushing out. Specifically, there's the Dairy Digester Research and Development Program, which has pushed out millions and millions of dollars in order to help fund the construction and research of these anaerobic digesters. Other things that I'm interested in are, in California, there's the Healthy Soils Program, which is a grant program to fund research of, exactly what it is, soil and land management strategies that help cultivate what the state is calling healthy soils. And a lot of those grants go into, application of these organic amendments that previous research has shown has really good to help really build healthy soils and climate smart soils, which is another area of interest of mine.
It's cool. So tell us about your study, and I don't know if you'd be willing to share some of the cool graphics you showed me, but if you'd be willing to run us through that'd be really awesome.
Yeah. So this is kind of an abbreviated version of a presentation I made for the American Chemical Society. I'm having trouble sharing my screen.
That's all right.
But I think it's disabled. By the host.
Here, hold on. All right, now you should be able to try. Try again. If not, we'll just roll with that.
Yep. All right, awesome. Are you seeing?
Yes.
Sorry, I don't want to. Sorry, one sec, Peter.
No worries.
Because it got, and it's like a recording over it that I don't want. That I forgot was there.
Well, so while you're doing this, what were you seeking to kind of say with this presentation, or what did the research ultimately say? So
basically, I'm really comparing biochar, the effects of biochar versus anaerobic digestate when applied to soils, because they kind of have somewhat contrasting findings, somewhat. But then also there's pretty interesting findings in terms of because I have a couple different soils that I got from different areas of California dairies. So there's a soil from Central Valley, there's soils from Southern California, soils from the North Coast area of California dairies, and there's some interesting findings there that I think are really interesting.
Great. Well, so we could just use it like this. I think people can peek in and see this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I got it now. So. Okay. All right. So, like I mentioned before, manure management, the motivation behind this research is the fact that manure management and crop production is a contributor of greenhouse gas and ammonia emissions, and the state of California, particularly the Dairy Digester Research and Development Program, Healthy Soils Program, as part of the California Department of Food and Agriculture, are help motivating this research. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you all know all the amazing benefits of biochar. Some of the things that I'm interested in are these reduced N2O soil emissions, and hopefully, the burning question is increased soil carbon sequestration.
Mm-hmm.
But part of my research is like comparing, contrasting these different organic amendments that are stemming from from pretty much the same feedstock, right? We're still talking about dairy manure. There's the different managements of the dairy manure, and comparing, pyrolysis into biochar into the anaerobic digestate process.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of you who don't know, anaerobic digestion is pretty much any sort of organic material, food, in this case, manure, dairy manure, goes into a digestion tank where under very low oxygen conditions, microbes eat up the organic material in the manure and thus emit methane, and that methane is captured on site and can be reused as biogas or reused for a number of different things. But what I'm interested in is what they're calling, these co-products, or what I'm calling anaerobic digestate, which is basically the effluent of the anaerobic digester process. And similar to biochar, it could potentially have a lot of really cool climate benefits when land applied.
Mm-hmm.
So
So you take the digester, it runs, you get off, you go through your process. At the end of it, right, you have to take everything out of the digester. That's digestate. And so the idea is to mix it with the biochar, or were you testing it, alternatively?
So this is like, what I'm going to show right now is brief summary of the summary of basically two separate experiments,
Mm-hmm.
where in one experiment, biochar was applied to dairy soils, and another experiment, anaerobic digestate, was applied to dairy soils,
Mm-hmm.
and both of those are compared to conventional manure spreading, which is a big way of managing manure.
Mm-hmm.
Some cool pictures. So I was lucky enough to work with dairy collaborators that gave me solid dairy manure here in Southern California. And this particular dairy, they pyrolyzed that solid manure into dairy manure biochar that I was able to get my hands on. And then I was also lucky enough to work with a collaborator in Northern California, in Marin County of California, where they have an anaerobic digester, and they've been using that for quite some time now. And they gave me some of that effluent of the digester, where you can tell it's really different. Like it's much more slurry-like. It's mostly like a liquid product.
Mm-hmm.
And so the handling of these materials is very different.
Right.
And so I work in a lab. So I work in a lab here at UC-Riverside. And so right now I'm focused on lab experiments, where I was able to run these incubation experiments of, I got soil from different regions of California and land apply it with these amendments, and I measured them. I measured the gases in real time using what these instruments are called picaros. They're from the Picar company, but really what they are is they're called cavity ring down spectrometers. But really what that means is, using these like a set of lasers and mirrors, we're able to gather greenhouse gas concentrations in real time.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
And so let's go a little bit into more of my work. So in the biochar experiment, I compared CO2 emissions after biochar application as opposed to manure application, and compared it under different temperatures and under a couple different soil locations.
Mm-hmm.
And so the main finding here, as you can see, is like the biochar made from the specific dairy manure that we're talking about here. So this is a really cool figure, was able to significantly reduce soil CO2 emissions across the two locations. Right now we're talking about Riverside, which is here in Southern California, and Tulare County, which is like part of that big Central Valley dairy region.
Mm-hmm.
Biochar was able to significantly reduce these soil CO2 emissions as opposed to solid manure. And so this was a really cool finding, because we're able to see, like, specifically this dairy manure is made into the biochar, and just by the process of pyrolysis, a huge reduction in CO2 emissions.
So that's fascinating. So you have basically what you're seeing is from a CO2 perspective, the same manure, right? One spread directly in the field, and the other pyrolyzed and then spread directly on the field. One is just basically helps or reduces the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere by something like 4, or a factor of 2, or a factor of 3, something.
Yeah, like it could go up by, so it's about, like, I think in some of these places like 60%.
Yeah.
In bars. And so that's really huge. Obviously, we know that the biochar, once it's pyrolyzed, it's like much more carbon content. So we're adding a lot more carbon to these soils. Um, and what's cool about specifically dairy manure biochar is because dairy manure is really high in nitrogen content. We're adding an ample amount of nitrogen to these soils, as opposed to some feedstocks, which are like much higher carbon content and not so much nitrogen content. This is like a little bit more of an even mix, maybe not even mix. Obviously, there's a lot more carbon in these biochars, but we're still adding a good amount of nitrogen to these soils.
That's great.
And the effects of biochar are able to hold up pretty well under different temperatures. So when I bumped up the temperature by a good 6 degrees C, we're still able to see the effects that biochar was able to really lower down these soil CO2 emissions. And really, like in this Riverside case, was able to be pretty in line with the control where nothing was added at all.
That's interesting. Even well, I guess in most cases, even if there are slightly higher CO2 emissions, we're talking about something in which you added a lot of nutrients and a lot of carbon to the soil, versus the blue line there, which is you literally made no changes, right?
No changes at all. And so these are cumulative emissions over like the course of like a 6-week incubation. And also in these figures, I normalized each bar by basically by how much carbon content is on this, because it's easy to say, oh, well, of course, different soils have different carbon contents, and that's why we're seeing different numbers, but these are already normalized by the amount of carbon that was both added and then also native to the soil.
Oh, cool.
Which is cool.
Yeah.
And if we compare that to some work I've done with anaerobic digestate, so this is a different experiment, but the goal of it was the same, to kind of measure the CO2 emissions after land application of anaerobic digestate. And so here we're looking again, control in blue. Obviously, we're adding in solid manure in orange, and we see a big bump in, soil respiration and CO2 emissions. But then we're interested in this yellow bar, which is, and this experiment was a combination of manure and anaerobic digestate. And this was done in order to get like the similar nitrogen content of things. But what's interesting is that the anaerobic digestate has both temperature and location dependent effects on soil CO2 emissions. So it's much more depends on the management and the situation, as opposed to what we saw with the biochar, where there was just like a clear reduction across the board. Particularly looking, at between in the Tulare location. So again, we're talking here in the Central Valley, where a lot of Central Valley dairies are getting an anaerobic digester installed soon, where under a lower temperature, application of the manure and anaerobic digestate reduced soil CO2 emissions. Right. While at the elevated temperature, there actually was a slight increase in CO2 emissions as opposed to just regular manure. So that tells me that there's something about maybe potentially this particular digestate that might be maybe temperature affected, but only in this certain context of this Tulare soil, which is like much different organic matter content, potentially differences in soil texture, and then obviously like the legacy effects of like how the soil was managed over long periods of time that this dairy has existed on this land.
Cool. And then, this is the N20 thing is super interesting. So
yeah, so this is a comparison of N20, and here we're more kind of directly able to compare the effects of the biochar and the anaerobic digestate together. Still, it's kind of like we're still talking about two different experiments, but the results are still pretty interesting, comparable, where biochar was able to statistically significantly reduce soil N2O emissions, while the anaerobic digestate does not. There was not a statistical difference between manure only and the anaerobic digestate included in there. And that's probably due to the difference between the two processes, where under the anaerobic digestate process, a lot of that organic nitrogen in dairy manure becomes in mineral form. So anaerobic digesters coming out of the anaerobic digestate coming out of the digester process, there's a really high ammoniacal nitrogen content when land applied. Depending on like the soil itself, the organic matter, and the soil microbial communities that exist there, a lot of that nitrogen is able to be mineralized and available and will be emitted as N2O.
Yeah.
During the nitrification process, because we're adding in a lot of ammonium. But I think a really interesting area of research regarding N2O and these organic amendments is like kind of delving more deeper into the mechanisms that underlie of like what is creating these N2O emissions, particularly for anaerobic digestate. And there's these really cool instruments that you can use, stable isotopes of like, okay, is this N2O a product of nitrification versus denitrification versus all these other biological and physical processes that happen in soil nitrogen dynamics.
Super interesting.
But it was interesting that these biochar was still able to, pretty impressively reduce soil N2O emissions. If we're looking here at the Tulare location, was able to really significantly bring down those N2O emissions.
Right, and what we're looking at here, where it says biochar, this is dairy manure biochar.
Dairy manure biochar. So right now we're all talking about dairy manure amendments as opposed to.
So I don't know. As a layperson, what I take away from this is that biochar. So digestate is probably not significantly reducing the field-based greenhouse gases and may increase it and slightly decrease it based on the environment. But having gone through a digester, it reduces some of the, you capture a ton of methane in that. And so that might change things relative to, pure manure, right?
Yeah, there is definitely going to have to be like a really careful calculation of the trade-offs between potential carbon capture and methane, potentially carbon storage once land applied into soil, because digestate carbon usually is more stable than pre-digester.
Oh, interesting.
So the digestion process, because all that labile organic carbon is being captured as methane, what organic carbon is left in the digester is relatively stable. I would be interested in seeing like a comparison on like the chemical structure of like biochar and anaerobic digestate. I don't think the digestate organic carbon is as recalcitrant as biochar carbon, but it could probably stay, it's definitely much more stable than pre-digester dairy manure carbon. But then a trade-off of, sorry.
Has anyone either mixed biochar with digestate to see if it has similar effects on this as it had on manure effectively? Like, could you figure out if you could reduce nitrous oxide and methane and CO2 release in digestate as well if you were applying, mixing in biochar either in the digester or after? That would be super interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't currently know of studies where these materials were kind of done, like the mixing of those materials were done like pre-land application. Like there's a couple studies where like in lab incubations, like what I've done, they've mixed in digestate from a source and biochar from a different source and mixed that in. And they saw pretty similar effects. I've also seen studies where they kind of treated, they had dairy manure and they digested dairy manure, and they went the extra step of pyrolyzing the anaerobic digestate from the dairy manure. So they had like kind of a stepwise function. And they saw as you go down the line of raw manure, digested manure, pyrolyzed digested manure, that they saw even more and more decreasing greenhouse gas emissions as you go down the line.
Right.
But I would be interested in like what would be, kind of what you and I have talked about, where adding in biochar into the anaerobic digestate process and then taking that effluent and land applying it, what would that look like, and what would be the results of that? I don't know.
Well, there you go. You're already a PhD student, so I can't tell you that maybe this should be your PhD, but alas. I think this to me is really exciting, and although we've spent a lot of time talking about anaerobic digesters. Obviously, that matters a lot for climate because of greenhouse gas, the kind of overall greenhouse gas picture. I'm super excited about this because, if we're going to make livestock raising a part of this future world in which we need things to be effective for the climate, we're going to need to invest a lot in this, and it seems like California is a place where there is a ton of investment in this, and 100 large anaerobic digesters going in all over California over the next few years means that there's real opportunities, at least in my mind, to either hopefully experiment with this stuff in the short term, and then long term do the kind of thing that you just mentioned. You sent me a paper which kind of runs through those steps, which is super interesting, and I'll post when I post this video.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and especially with the vast amount of land that California has, there's opportunity for really cool measurements of the land application of these materials. And so I'm really excited for when these dairies, when these dairies start land applying all these different new ways of their manure management. People like me can come in and measure the effects of that from both from a climate perspective, but there's a whole other realm of research of what's going on below ground with soil health indicators, and also there's really interesting people doing really cool modeling of. We know that California is going to be generating so much waste. What can we do with it? What is the and where can we apply it where it would have the best climate effects? I think those are all really neat opportunities for that.
Awesome. Well, so I want to wrap up before we go too long here. But I want to say, one, thank you, and then two, can people in the community reach out if they're interested in anaerobic digesters and biochar and that whole world?
Yeah. So you can definitely reach out to me. I'm on Twitter now, so it's at Michael V ROD3. It's Michael at Michael V ROD3, and so come talk to me. Yeah, come talk to me. Anything climate, organic amendments. I'm really interested in these processes and because I think there's huge opportunity not only in the dairy industry, but I know in municipal solid waste with food, food waste management, and I'm really interested in what I say I'm mostly interested in kind of the integration of all these different disciplines. There's soil science, there's waste management, there's climate change, there's atmospheric chemistry, and all these different disciplines can really combine together to create these really cool ideas.
Well, I can't sum it up better than that. Thank you, Michael. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much.